You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
When it comes to ensuring your company has top-notch security practices, things can get complicated fast. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more, saving you time and money. With Vanta, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Flow Health, and Quora use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Our listeners can claim a special offer of $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/cyber. That's VANTA.com/cyber for $1,000 off Vanta.
Welcome to Research Saturday, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. I am Brandon Karpf, the Executive Editor and Vice President of N2K Networks, and your host for today's episode.
A naval cryptological officer doing routine duties offshore in the South China Sea, sort of looking at Malaysia, and there's a vulnerability that has been exploited in a Japanese-installed port crane in Malaysia.
Over the last few years, we've seen a rapid increase in tensions and competition in the Indo-Pacific region, specifically pitting the U.S. and China against one another and each other's allies and partners in that region of the world. We've seen increases in cyber activity launched by Volt Typhoon, the advanced persistent threat coming from the Chinese military and government. We've seen increased tensions caused by island-building campaigns in the South China Sea. And we've seen trade relationships rise and fall throughout the entire region. Our discussion today is with Kevin Lentz, a graduate student at UT Austin and the team leader of the Cyber Pacific Project at the Global Disinformation Lab. They recently published a report on cyber competition in the Indo-Pacific Gray Zone 2035, a threat-casting activity that they ran earlier this year, exploring what the private sector, the public sector, military, government, academia, and policymakers can do to ensure that the United States and Western nation allies prevail in a world of growing competition and tensions in this region of the world. And this episode is brought to you exclusively by our sponsor and partner, Keeper Security. So, Kevin, the reason I invited you on, we got this threat casting report around cyber competition in the Indo-Pacific Gray Zone 2035. I thought it was particularly important for our audience, obviously given the relevance to cyber competition and cybersecurity, and then ultimately national security. So before we dive into this report, though, can you give the audience a sense of what is threat casting?
Sure. It's a great question because it's not a very well-known technique, but I'll go ahead and outline what it is. So it is a structured analytic technique, structured analytic foresight technique, I should say. And this is a bit of a complicated process, but it breaks down into identifying a question, assembling a panel of subject matter experts who can answer the question or provide perspectives on it. And Brandon, you were one of those, and it was a great contribution. And then assembling a few dozen relevant participants at a 2-day workshop who will crank out and work on scenarios that look about 10 years in the future on the question. And the central premise is imagining a person specifically, which is what makes threat casting unique, is you're imagining a future person experiencing a future threat in a specific place. So a person in a place experiencing a threat. And then you sort of ask the participants, you break into small groups to build these models. So each person that they generate as a model with as much detail as possible. And so by putting the participants in the perspective of a future human, It kind of personifies things and brings it to a level of detail and practicality that is unique. And so then they create a bunch of models, and then we gather all those models, and on the back end, a team of analysts, in this case myself and some others from the University of Texas and some other schools, and we go through the models and sort of cluster significant findings, things that deviate, and we do some further back-end research on context, things like that, and then a few months later we produce a report.
Nice. So it seems like it's a way of developing strategy or insights into a future state of the world from numerous perspectives. When it comes to this specific threat casting event that you hosted and the report that you've recently published, what was that central question that you wanted to answer?
Right. So the central theme was, as you said, cyber competition in Indo-Pacific Gray Zone 2035. And the question we were trying to answer was, what can and should the U.S. and Indo-Pacific allies and partners do to enhance combined cyber defensive operations, sort of mitigate the threats that we're seeing in the future and, essentially prevail in the competition?
Specifically in the Western Pacific or any region of the Pacific?
We took Indo-Pacific writ large. It ended up being focused around, current hotspots, East China Sea, South China Sea.
Got it. So, thinking about what you were saying, some of the outcomes or some of the outputs of this threat casting, what were some of those personas or those stories and the insights that you and the other analysts were able to extract from this event?
Sure. So one interesting story, and it's in the report. So the report's not like a normal report, I should say up front. There is sort of an XSUM at the beginning and normal stuff, but then peppered throughout it, there are sort of these fictional narratives of these models. So one of the models that's in there I think is interesting is from a naval cryptological officer sort of doing routine duties offshore in the South China Sea, sort of looking at Malaysia. And there's a vulnerability that has been exploited in a Japanese-installed port crane in Malaysia. So, it's a complex scenario already, but it's, Asia's a complex place.
Right.
And so this vulnerability is exploited, and there's chaos in Malaysia, and there are simultaneous information operations that are complementing the adversarial exploitation. And the long and short is that it ends up costing U.S. and allies and partners politically, Malaysia, goodwill, and cooperation.
Us today and other cyber professionals recognize the potential impacts. We take the most recent event with CrowdStrike and Microsoft, a very relevant analogy that had global implications. To what extent were modern or current companies and technologies considered when you and the other analysts and participants were going through this exercise?
Yeah, so they're sort of the bedrock, right?
Okay.
There's a certain amount of suspension of belief in trying to push the boundaries. But in this case, I think what we came down on is that the parameters of cyber are kind of set in a way. Obviously, things are going to change. LLMs are going to get better. Fake everything will get a lot better.
Yes, totally.
And that's going to hit, that'll hit a threshold where things change qualitatively for sure. But sort of the use that they are being used for and the companies producing them are kind of similar. So it was based on current companies and capabilities for the most part.
And, thinking about now that the report has been published and, has a series of these vignettes as well as the contributed reports from various industry experts and analysts, how do you envision the industry, the community using this report? Who is the intended audience? How should people read this and why should they read it?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So one of the benefits of the threat casting model is that the audience is sort of baked into the process because in a large part, the audience is comprised of the participants. So we had over 30 participants, and these are folks we kind of handpicked and invited from across the spectrum. We had, intel, military, government, public sector, academia, and then folks in the private sector as well. And so these folks come and they bring their institutional knowledge and experience, and then the report goes, the network building and the report and the ideas of the report that they sort of come up with inherently go out with them, and they're sort of the first tranche of recipients of the final report. So they're sort of the front lines. And then beyond that, the report is intended to influence policymakers in this area, as well as practitioners, and that's broad. But it is, I think, a pro and a con of the report is that we decided not to tailor it specifically to a single institutional actor.
Okay.
And so we got a lot of interesting results from that. But I think as well, the report is intended to hit a broad audience.
And, thinking about the audience that we're speaking to right now, probably about 20 to 30% are somehow associated with government, defense technology or what have you. But that leaves another 70, 80% of this audience who are primarily private sector. How can private sector use this type of modeling, this type of narrative storytelling, or this exact report in their own efforts furthering the pursuit of cybersecurity?
On the one hand, the private sector uses a threat casting model a lot more frequently than the public sector does. As an aside, it was developed in the private sector by a guy at Intel who sort of developed it in-house and used it, and then he spun it out. And that's sort of where that came from. So the public sector, private sector, this would definitely benefit them in terms of thinking about risk, because that's sort of the big thing nowadays is, where do you make your investments when, we're on this knife edge type situation and it's going to persist for a decade. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, as you said, is the private sector cybersecurity industry is huge, and it's only growing.
Yes.
And it's only going to grow, most likely, if I had to guess, that's a safe bet. And so I think there exists massive capabilities, and this is one of the findings in the report, is sort of like private sector, I end up calling them kingmakers, because they have the scale and the capability and the speed and the efficiency and everything to make or break efforts in cyber.
Right.
But maybe it would help for them to read it to sort of think about how to approach and tell the narrative of their companies and their interests and tie that into the broader national security picture. So that's a bit of a vague answer, but hopefully it gets at what you're asking.
Well, to all of the cybersecurity king and queen makers out there, read the report then. It sounds like there's some valuable information in there for you and the way that you can influence. All right, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, Kevin and I are going to dig into the key findings and his recommendations from the report. We'll be right back.
Hey everybody, Dave here. Have you ever wondered where your personal information is lurking online? Like many of you, I was concerned about my data being sold by data brokers. So I decided to try Delete Me. I have to say, Delete Me is a game changer. Within days of signing up, they started removing my personal information from hundreds of data brokers. I finally have peace of mind knowing my data privacy is protected. Delete Me's team does all the work for you with detailed reports, so you know exactly what's been done. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and use promo code N2K at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and enter code N2K at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/N2K, code N2K.
So, Kevin, I want to give you an opportunity to cover what were the key findings from this report. I really like to understand the major takeaways.
Yeah, I'll hit the key findings and then also the recommendations, which is only 3. But findings-wise, we had 4. And the first one is that this idea that third-party cyber, we end up calling them kingmakers or queenmakers, like we were just talking about. And these are folks and institutions and agencies between the 2 major contestants right now, U.S. and China, for, unfortunately, it's the way it is. But there's these 2 groups of kingmakers on the one hand that can sort of make or break these efforts that are going to be central to working with and organizing and balancing to make anything happen. So on the one hand, you have technological ones, and these are the companies, the cybersecurity industries, but also the infrastructure providers, the folks actually building the cables, the platforms that are, de facto sovereigns in terms of making law-adjacent decisions on what stands in the information environment, for example. So you have all those in one bucket, and then the other one is the political ones. So thinking here of Southeast Asia, you have this constellation of extremely fast-growing, young, developing countries with sort of a multi-alignment strategy because they reaping benefits from both sides of this competition from our perspective here. And they'll continue to do that, and that's great. It's a win-win situation as long as things don't spill into conflict.
Right, yeah, of course.
But that being said, a country like Indonesia, for example, Vietnam, making a strong stand, this seriously shapes the strategic environment. And so that's one thing. Second finding, fragmented regulatory authority is going to continue to compound regulatory lag. So that's a slightly convoluted, but a simple idea is that there's a legal and policy gray zone, right? In terms of who's in charge in cyberspace. So because it hits us kind of right in the intersection of all these different authorities. It's a domestic legal problem. It's crime, a lot of cases, like crypto and ransomware and everything.
Right.
But then it's being launched as part of a international campaign by an adversary. So who's in charge? We don't really know. And so you have CISA, for example, but that's a young organization. They don't necessarily have all the capabilities and authorities they need. And so more established actors are stepping in, and the picture is just getting very complicated. And the example we pull out here is cybersecurity incident reporting laws or lack thereof. There's all these different laws. Every state's got one. And there are multiple federal agencies that have decided that they have the authority to make a law about it. And so they have, and then courts are involved. So it's a messy situation, will continue to be messy.
Right.
Third finding is that the irregular strategic competition between the U.S. and Chinese Communist Party is going to set the overall parameters for the use and development of cyber power. And so this is basically just trying to underscore the idea that conventional deterrence will hold for the most part. Like we assess that it will. And if it doesn't,
we've got other problems.
Yeah, we've got a lot of other problems. We're not going to be on a podcast talking, it'll be a different situation.
Right.
So assuming conventional deterrence holds, we're going to be in this situation that's it resonates with the 50s. And this sort of is another theme of the report. We've kind of been here before. The idea of the gray zone actually first gets coined in the 50s. So it's an old problem, but
right.
We're going to have this sort of irregular warfare type situation without the warfare. So it's going to be dirty tricks, sleight of hand, and subtlety or lack thereof in this gray zone. and that will persist. So that's sort of, and it's, the major two contestants are the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party.
Sure. And then how about you mentioned there were the key takeaways and then recommendations. So what were the key recommendations?
Yeah, recommendations. The first one, it was unexpected but very interesting, and that's that the U.S. should develop and operationalize a distinct cyber economic trade and development strategy for the region.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, we have in the U.S., we say cyber is a functional thing and the Indo-Pacific is a regional thing. And so we go at it from these two different perspectives. But if you combine them, cyber and cybersecurity is a development problem. This is computers, computer networks. These are expensive. They require electrification. They require all these things that we take for granted in the U.S., but much of the world goes without or is in the process of developing. So there are efforts underway in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to sort of like tack on cybersecurity as a sort of afterthought. But they should be more centralized because cyberspace is a unique domain in that we're literally building it. And so who builds it? The rules they set when they build it, configurations, this whole thing make the literal space of cyberspace.
Yeah.
So we can have a permanent uphill battle, or we can have like a level playing field. Obviously, we would want the latter. Second recommendation is to rebuild and recenter political and information warfare capabilities for this cyber competition. Cyber today, we will probably talk about in 5 ways, the same way we used to talk about digital economy. It's redundant. The whole economy has become digital. There's not like a separate digital economy now. So our cyber problems are just our regular political problems. And so in terms of developing, being competitive in this space, it's going to require the government to speak with a single voice consistently and hit on norms we want, behavior we want, this kind of thing. And it's something that we lacked historically, we still lack, and so we still need to develop it. And then the final one is this idea that we should work with allies and partners to develop a Indo-Pacific cyber and conventional open access intelligence clearinghouse. We're in a permanent state of crisis. We're sort of tap dancing on a red line in the South China Sea all the time. That's going to continue, that sort of cat and mouse. But it's a situation where if country A doesn't have a clear idea of what happened in event X involving these two countries, country B and country C or whatever, country A and country B, that increases the space for miscalculation, misunderstandings. And the intelligence apparatus and the way that it is organized and disseminated, it's hard to get certain data and certain information out there if it's classified in the U.S. We have an institutional culture of sort of going it alone, not sharing with allies unless we absolutely have to, but we've got to get faster at it. And, the sort of takeaway here is like, maybe we should just circumvent this whole thing alone, circumvent it altogether, and build up a way to share this sort of, imagery, radio frequency, this kind of information from the ground up. Because going through institutional reform and change, long process, difficult process. So those are the 3 recommendations, Brandon.
Truly the hacker way. Break down the problem into its constituent parts, and why don't we just rebuild the whole thing?
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
Well, the report is a threat casting publication, Cyber Competition in the Indo-Pacific Gray Zone 2035, published by the Army Cyber Institute and University of Texas. We will have a link to that report in the show notes. And Kevin, so great to have you on. Thank you for filling us in.
Brandon, really appreciate you having me on.
And that's Research Saturday, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. Our thanks to Kevin Lentz, team leader of the Cyber Pacific Project at the Global Disinformation Lab, for joining us. The research is Cyber Competition in the Indo-Pacific Gray Zone 2035. You can find a link and additional resources in the show notes. We would love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like the show, please share a rating and review in your podcast app. It really does help. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to cyberwire@n2k.com. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. We're mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Simone Petrella is our president. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I'm Brandon Karff. Thanks for listening.